Hi there, Lewis here again from Take Two Films. Today I'll be telling you about the history of the crime genre and how the genre has changed its conventions, and also how more modern films have also kept to the conventions whilst also challenging them at the same time. The crime genre is popular and has steadily gained popularity ever since the early films like Psycho, which can be classed as a crime film, were released. But Alfred Hitchcock wasn't heavily involved in the crime genre like Quentin Tarantino or Martin Scorsese, as he mainly focused on the thriller/horror. The crime genre really started to gain attention when The Godfather was a huge Hollywood hit, and ever since then we've had the typical cops and robbers storylines like Heat, but also films like Pulp Fiction and Taxi Driver, which really challenged the typical conventions of a crime film. In my opinion, the crime genre started early on, but it developed from being an element in the early thrillers to become its own isolated genre, which films like The Godfather, Goodfellas and modern films like Focus and Nightcrawler represent. Camera work has developed, with new camera equipment being used in both big budget movies and even smaller films like mine. I know that I will be using sliders, camera rigs, steady cams when it comes to filming, as it makes my film look professional, like it is done with The Godfather, Focus, Goodfellas and Heat. Camera quality has also developed, with modern films being shot in 4K quality, which shows that the genre has obviously moved with the times, so it isn't really standing still like some genres which tend to use vintage cameras for authenticity. Technology has really influenced the crime genre, although it might not be a crime noir style anymore. In the modern day films are also what people want to see, as it's set in current era, and the film follows typical conventions of a modern crime film, and also it's set in modern cities where people go on holiday to, and it also adds a sense of realism, as it feels like, crime can be taking place in the very city that they live, or just across the pond like in America and other places like that. Sound and editing also haven't changed, with a heavy reliance on narrative and dialogue, with films like Focus and Nightcrawler being so focused on the character's emotion through their speech, as longer takes are still being used, and the sound and editing side of the film still creates a sense of who has all the power in the viewer's minds, and the length of one take can make a character go from your average regular character to the main plot twisting evil villain that we all love to see. It's clear to see that the typical conventions of a heavy reliance on dialogue in the crime genre isn't outdated, and the key components of the crime genre haven't changed, even though technology and Hollywood has, and it kind of shows that the crime genre has followed with the times, but it's still kept the same key conventions, which shows that the crime genre hasn't really developed in terms of how the bigger details are, like the way that dialogue has been used and CGI and stuff like that, as CGI is barely used in all modern crime films, which is very surprising. But it has changed the smaller details and moved with the times in terms of costume and also technology in the film as well, because you wouldn't see an old 1950s Volkswagen Beetle, you'd see a modern day car, like your average cars that you see in backgrounds, and then you also see the characters' cars like a Dodge Challenger, like we see in Nightcrawler. So the effects of the cars that you see in modern day, so say you see a newer car, you're obviously going to point that out. Same in the older films where you see a Tommy gun, you'd be like, oh well, that's set in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and in my opinion the crime genre hasn't changed at all in terms of how the props and the facial expression and the characters are shown, but it has changed in terms of what props have been used, and also how the characters have changed as well, because you start to see the more psychological side of most characters now, whereas if The Godfather was set in this time, you'd see Vito very differently, because he'd be more psychological, and you wouldn't see a heavy reliance on violence as you did back then, but you'd still get to see it still have the same impact, even though no violence has really been used. And also you get to see sort of a different sort of branch of the crime genre, as con artists and also stringers, and also just your typical crime films like Fast and Furious, where it involves stealing cars or trying to save people and stuff like that. The crime genre has really developed, and it isn't the basic sort of cops versus robbers that you usually see. It's much more than that, and even though it might seem like, oh, you wouldn't think Fast and Furious is a crime film, you think it's action or a sort of like your typical car film, it still technically is, because it does involve crime. Same with Nightcrawler and Focus, because conning people out of their money is definitely a crime, and it's just a lot more psychological. And I think that the crime genre has changed for the better. In my opinion, the crime genre has changed for the worse, with early films being a clear indication of what to expect from all crime films, and from watching these films I understand the cinematography aspects of the crime genre, and when I watch more modern films from the crime genre, they're not stuck in the 1900s, they're developed and still kept a specific balance between dialogue and action. You see a fair amount of CGI, but it is very useful to the storyline and tells the story in its own way, and it isn't being used just to gain an audience of people who love explosions and huge battles, because you see that in all superhero films from Marvel and DC. It is an artistic genre that requires a huge amount of focus on dialogue between the characters and their facial expression, which causes the audience to be on the edge of their seats and as the plot unravels. I think the crime genre is brilliant, and I chose it because last year I studied thriller, obviously, but I wanted to sort of go into a more specific genre where it's isolated and there's not just, because most thriller films do contain a lot of crime, but a big focus on crime is very important for all crime films.
You talking to me? You talking to me?
Thank you for watching my history of the crime genre, and I hope you enjoy, and I will see you in all future blog posts and blog videos. And watch out for my next video, where I will be discussing the timeline of the crime genre, and also how different films like Taxi Driver and Goodfellas and The Godfather have all been viewed by the audiences, and also how modern films have changed the way that the audiences view films.